We are live. And we are
Afternoon,
recording.
everyone. We'd like to welcome you to the AIB Pillar 4 Committee November meeting. Today we have a full agenda where we will get some AIB updates and learn about the speakers that are here with us today. This is a work group presentation around improving education for students with disabilities. So we have a team that is here to present to us about that and answer any questions. Then we'll move into any of future topics and setting that agenda for not only December initiatives, but then into the early 2025 schedule as well. So at this time, I'll turn it over for our AIB updates.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for lending your time for today's meeting. And here are the updates from the AIB. We will be recruiting and hiring for the Government Relations Director position very soon. This position will work closely with our Executive Director and our Board of Directors during the upcoming General Assembly session. Thursday is our AIB board meeting, and we are working through the approval process for LEA plans. 2 LEAs have received full plan approval during the last board's meeting. And just as a reminder, approval consists of the following blueprint plan components. LEA plans 1 and 2, response to question 23, career ladder, literacy plan, maintenance of certification, 10% salary increase attestation, and career counseling MOU if applicable. We want to note that any LEA that does not have all components approved by our November board meeting will receive a letter on December 1st, alerting them to the possibility of their blueprint funding increase being withheld. And that concludes the AIB updates for this month. Back to you, Chair Hope.
Thank you. One quick question. Is it public knowledge who are those two people who got
Yes,
approval?
yes. It's St. Mary's County and Garrett County.
Perfect.
And applause for them.
Perfect. And so next we'll go in directly to making sure if there's no other questions for the committee for AIB. We good? So we'll go into our work group presentation. And today what I'll have them do is actually go around and introduce themselves and tell their positions and how it aligns to the cross-pillar work and the connections that we have with Pillar 4, and especially all that we do around supporting students. So I'll start with Dr. Hipkin.
Good evening. How's everyone? Good. I see smiles. I am Dr. Antoine Hickman. I'm the Assistant State Superintendent for the Division of Early Intervention and Special Education Services. And my connection to the Blueprint Pillar 4 and Pillar 1 is a direct one. Our focus is on making sure that our students with disabilities receive a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. I've been able to say that statement for most of my career. In terms of the pillar and the blueprint, most of my work since I've been here, and I celebrated my anniversary, my work anniversary on November 15th. And so I've been here a year, and a lot of the work that we've been doing has been tied to the blueprint as a whole, because we've been able to participate on the school reviews and really all the pillars, but focused more narrowly on Pillar 4, with support and helping with our students with disabilities, Pillar 1, our early childhood, and also our CCR supports for for Pillar 4 as well. And so with that, I could go a little bit deeper. We do have a presentation. Me and Ms. Zogby have put together a presentation on updates for the special ed work group. And I'm going to pause and I'm going to pass it to Ms. Zogby, and then Ms. Zogby, will you pass it back to Molly?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Liz Zogby. I'm the co-chair of the Maryland Down Syndrome Advocacy Coalition, and I'm co-chairing this Blueprint Special Education Work Group with Dr. Wright, and that's who I am. I really am looking forward to giving you this update on what we've been doing on the work group and the recommendations and prioritized plan that have come out of that work. On to Molly.
Hi, I'm Molly Connor. I am not on the work group. I am one of the MSDE folks who helps to support the work of the work group. I am the branch chief for performance support and technical assistance. So think of us as all things professional learning and technical assistance for our special education leaders in Maryland, ages 0 through 21.
Thank you. That's all from MSDE and Ms. Zogby as the co-chair. Do you want us to go into our presentation, or
Yes, please.
is it too much to ask just for a brief introduction since this is a small group? I know names, I see them, but I would like to, if you don't mind.
No problem at all. My name is Hope McGuire, and I'm the chair of the committee. And in my day job, I am the supervisor of community schools for Montgomery County Public Schools. I'll pass it to Ellie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ellie Mitchell. I am the director of the Maryland Out of School Time Network. We also serve as the backbone for the Maryland Coalition of Community Schools. And I serve as co-chair of this group, but also our vice chair of this group, and also the Maryland Education Coalition. And do you want me to pass it? I'll pass it to Kara.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kara Burhans. I work in Washington County for the public schools. My title is Strategic Initiatives Coordinator, which essentially is the blueprint and all other things. I've been a teacher. My certification is special education. So that is my heart. But I've also been an admin at elementary, middle, and high school, as well as a content supervisor. And now here. So pleasure to meet you and to serve. And I'll kick it to Joe.
Hey everyone, my name is Joseph Manco. I am one of the Accountability and Implementation Board members. I am also the Education Program Officer at the Able Foundation in Baltimore City and a former middle school teacher and elementary school principal. And I will now pass it to Shalita.
Hi, my name is Shalita Jones. I am a school-based speech language pathologist, so working closely with students with disabilities, as well as a research associate working in a social linguistics lab, and that is based out of Howard University.
Dr. Grant.
Good afternoon or good evening. I am Dr. Jessica Grant. I am a principal in Prince George's County Public School, K-5 comprehensive program. And thank you. And I'll pass it to Kaden.
Hi, my name is Kadeem Bell, and I'm the student member on the board for Caroline County Public Schools.
And I think that was it. We covered everybody. So you're good to go.
Well, thank you. Ms. Armstrong, are you going to share a screen? I tried to share, it wouldn't allow me to.
Hold on.
Okay,
Can you try now?
I will try now.
Yes.
What do you see?
I see
Presentation.
your.
Don't see my chat messages too.
No,
Okay.
we see your PowerPoint
Okay,
screen.
very good. I'm into the slideshow.
And you need an update too.
From beginning.
Your computer is asking you to update.
Oh,
see that.
see all that too? Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Remind later.
And just so
Okay.
you know, you're in presentation mode.
You can
So
see all of that too?
yes.
Oh, well, you know what? This is not going the way that I expected. We're just going to stay just like this.
Actually, you can go back, but if you do
Go back to presentation mode.
from the beginning, it should
From
give you
begin-
the
mhm.
option not to come out of presentation mode. Well, you should be able to change how we see it. Yeah, under display settings. Mhm.
This one.
Yes.
Mhm.
There you
Yeah.
go.
Awesome. I learned something live. Thank you very much. So again, we've done introductions, and the lead on this, even though I am the assistant state superintendent, Ms. Zabi does the co-chairing along with Dr. Wright, and she's done a phenomenal job with that. It's made my job a little bit easier in terms of getting an understanding of what the work is that we're doing. She's been here since it started, and so I'm going to let her start off, if you don't mind. You want me to go to the next slide?
Yes, please. So I just thought we would quickly kind of level set on where we started and sort of how we got to where we are today. So and I forgot one thing in my introduction, which is, you know, my entry ticket into this work is my 14-year-old daughter named Hope, who has Down syndrome. So I like to kind of give a shout out to Hope. So back in December of 2022, the Accountability and Implementation Board adopted their initial Blueprint Comprehensive Implementation Plan. And prior to that, some advocates had submitted a lot of comments about how the Blueprint, you know, set as a goal improving education for students with disabilities by increasing resources, but didn't have a lot programmatically about how LEAs were supposed to go about doing that, how they were supposed to spend those resources in order to achieve that goal. And so, you know, we were very pleased when the AIB added to its implementation plan, really at the last moment, this charge that MSDE convene a special education work group similar to the English language learners work group that had just completed its work at that time. And so, and the work group was to discuss and make recommendations on instruction, services, and funding for students with disabilities. It took about 9 months to kind of get that up and going, and the work group started in August of 2023. We have about 50 members with a wide variety of perspectives. So general education and special education teachers, parents, advocates, administrators, attorneys, physicians, all kinds of folks. And it's been a lot of work to kind of make sure that we're hearing all of those voices and really incorporating those perspectives into the recommendations that are coming out. But I think we've really, we've done a lot to create a process that's really transparent and open and allows folks to give a lot of input. It's been a really amazing process that we've gone through. And all of the materials are available on the website, and we've now completed 2 reports that are public and one that should be being submitted in a couple of weeks. And we'll probably have one more after that. Our meetings are all live streamed, and where the recordings are available for your binge watching pleasure over a weekend, perhaps. So you can kind of catch up on what you've missed. Next slide. So I thought I would just take you through kind of the arc of the topics that we've covered over this, you know, year plus that we've been meeting monthly, to kind of give you a sense of the ground that we've covered, because that charge of instruction, services, and funding is pretty enormous. And, you know, not many states have taken on this kind of comprehensive review of special education. So we were really laying on a lot of new ground. So we started by talking about the state of students with disabilities in Maryland and looking at data and taking quite a deep dive into the data, disaggregated to look at eligibility and identification, services, placement, achievement, graduation rates, all kinds of things. And, I sort of say, newsflash, the data is not great. Students with disabilities have underperformed and are underachieving, and there's a lot of work to do. And the reality is, and we talked about this in our opening meetings, and it's a refrain we've brought back over and over again, over the last 2 decades, Maryland has had many commissions and task forces and different really smart groups of people that have come together and dived into particular problems around special education and serving students with disabilities and come up with great recommendations. And yet we haven't moved the needle. And so one of the things we laid out in the very beginning was this idea that there are a particular known set of barriers that have prevented the implementation of some of these recommendations. And we wanted to be really aware of what those things were from the beginning, so that as we began to build a plan, our report wouldn't end up on a shelf that was nice and, looked beautiful up there, but wasn't actually making a difference for students. And so a couple of those barriers, and we come back to them again and again in our discussions, are the pervasive low expectations for students with disabilities. And we talk about that in 2 ways. It's the low expectations that individuals hold, right? Educators, parents, the students themselves, our systems as a whole. And then there's the expectations about really what does it mean? What should we actually expect in real terms for students with disabilities to be able to do? Students with disability, I'll come back to that in a second. So the second barrier is the siloing of special education and general education. So, we have separate systems for training teachers, for professional development, for reporting structures. And all of that separateness tends to keep us from making some of the progress I think we have hoped to make over time. And then funding, of course, is always a barrier. And then finally, standards, sort of really hoping that we could have our State Department lean into its responsibility and authority to develop policies and practices and procedures that ensure the full implementation of IDEA with fidelity across our whole state. So with those barriers in mind, we turn to expectations, as I was saying before, and we established as sort of a foundational recommendation that actually is in the process of being implemented right now. The idea that students with disabilities should be enabled through their IEPs to reach grade level standards. That's what special education is supposed to do in real terms. And so then we went through a series of topics after that to sort of say, well, if that's what the expectation is, what do we need to do in all of these different areas to actually make that a reality? So we talked about the integration of general and special education, multi-tiered systems of support, universal design for learning, all of these things that are in real terms what it means for when we say students with disabilities are general education students first. How does that actually happen? Well, it happens through MTSS, it happens through UDL. We did a session on specially designed instruction. What does that look like? What does it really mean? Are we doing a good job of communicating to all of our educators, including our general educators, what specially designed instruction is? We talked about effective IEP implementation. So this is a sort of loop of technical assistance, data collection, and monitoring and accountability. We talked about teacher qualifications, recruitment, and in particular, we focused a lot about talking about retention, because we know that, special educators what's the expression? It's tough. It's tough to be a special education teacher. The workloads are very high. The demands are very high. The number of meetings can be crushing. So what can we do to improve the quality of life and the experience of being a special educator to make sure that special educators stay with us and stay in our system? And then we talked about staffing and service delivery. So how do we arrange the adults in the building? Where do they go? Where do they deliver instruction? What kinds of staffing standards might we envision? What are the different kinds of staff roles? So things like IEP chairs, paraprofessionals, what are their roles and responsibilities? And then we looked at funding. So if we're going to make all these recommendations about what all these other topics would look like, what is that actually going to cost? And we talked about that. And then we turned to the least restrictive environment. We had a lot to talk about there. You know, Maryland is consistently for the last 40 years been in the top 5 for states that educate students with disabilities in the most segregated environments, in totally separate schools, and what the impact of that has been on our whole system. We talked about significant disproportionality, the issues with students with disabilities of color being overly identified for special education in particular categories, being placed in more restrictive environments, and having greater rates of exclusionary discipline. And then the last couple of months, we've talked about early childhood and infants and toddlers, and then authentic family partnerships. And now our remaining couple of topics later this week, we'll be talking about secondary transition. So how we start at age 14 here in Maryland, preparing students with disabilities to exit school, to go on to college, career, and community living. And then in December, we'll be talking about students with the most significant cognitive disabilities, who are the students who take the alternate assessment. And what can we do to both make sure we're appropriately identifying the right students to take the alternate assessment, but also improving their educational experiences and their long-term outcomes. And then finally, in January, we'll be talking about behavior and discipline, and thinking about how we can strengthen the development of students, their lagging skills and their coping skills to minimize concerning behavior, and preventing exclusionary discipline. So that's all we've been doing, not much. We'll turn to the next slide. And then this is how we've gone about our work. So we prepare a pre-reading for each one of our topics that kind of sets the foundation so that everybody's kind of starting from the same place. We've looked at some best practices, what the research says, what's happening here in Maryland, and poses some discussion questions in that reading. And then in our meetings themselves, which are live streamed, as I said, we have public comment. We review the feedback that we got from our previous meeting, and we talk about any recommendations that have come forward and approve those. Then we do an overview of the topic for that evening, and then we split up into small groups and we discuss those discussion questions and the reading, and we come back and report out. And then everyone leaves with an exit ticket. Over the few days after the meeting, we asked folks to put down in writing kind of their responses to those questions so that we can pull them together and kind of have a document that talks about what we decided and turn that into a recommendation for the next meeting. Next slide, please.
Before I go to the next slide, I'm sorry, I was
Yes.
looking for a microphone. Just so you know, all the things that you just shared in terms of the meetings at a glance, that website, we house everything on the website, on the Blueprint Special Education Work Group website, so you'll be able to see that as well. It's on the bottom of the slide. Next slide.
So this is a long list of the recommendations that have come out that we have approved to date. If you dive into some of the reports that are on our website, you can see them in all of their glory. And there's a lot there. I'm not going to go through them all. But this is yep. And that goes all the way to the end. And then we'll have a few more over the next couple of months, presumably. But the one thing that I did want to just dive into briefly was because I know that one of the things that I think you were all interested in hearing was kind of the intersection between the work that we're doing in the special ed work group and pillar 1 in particular. So 2 months ago we talked about early childhood, and we had 3 it was quite a big topic, and we talked about both pre-kindergarten programs, actually all 3 pre-kindergarten programs, childcare, and infants and toddlers, which is that sort of birth to 5 here in Maryland set of services under Part C of IDEA. But I thought I would just pull up the recommendation around pre-kindergarten, which is this recommendation 17 from the work group, and just give you a sense of kind of where we went with that. So if you want to go to the next slide, Dr. Hickman. So this recommendation had 3 parts, and it's all about increasing access to inclusive, high-quality pre-K. So one of the things that we talked a lot about was, and I think kind of the overarching concern, is that a mixed delivery system, I think we all agree, is a great way to expand pre-K to all kids. But our concern was, without a lot of intentionality, our fear was that we might end up with a 2-tiered system where students with disabilities end up in public pre-K programs and students without disabilities are primarily in the private providers that are publicly funded. Because figuring out how to serve students with disabilities, with a range of disabilities in private provider settings, adds some complexity to the picture. And there's already a lot of complexity. So that was kind of what we were grappling with. The first bullet point here is the recommendation that the General Assembly should expand Tier 1 for pre-K expansion to include all 3 and 4-year-old children with disabilities, regardless of family income, for prioritization for seats and for full funding. So over the last couple of years, there's been sort of short-term fixes for that. But I think we came to the agreement that really was the intention from the outset, that we want to make sure that that students with disabilities are all included. The second one is to ensure that that 3 and 4-year-olds with disabilities who attend any publicly funded pre-K program, so that's both private programs and public programs, get the services and supports that they need, and for MSDE to provide additional guidance to the LEAs and hold LEAs accountable for making sure that the Blueprint special education weight funding that they get to serve those students actually gets passed along to those private provider programs. So there's, again, a lot of complexity there. And then finally, this sort of overarching that MSDE should develop a plan to make sure that the specific challenges of pre-K expansion and the mixed delivery system will meet the needs of students with disabilities. So that's thinking about recruiting and preparing private pre-K providers, thinking about transportation and what that means for students with disabilities, and then also a question around facilities requirements, thinking about how do we work in public spaces to make sure that there's space in elementary schools for pre-K and maybe in new buildings to meet the needs of pre-K students with disabilities. So that also kind of gives you a little bit of a taste of the kinds of recommendations that we were coming up with, and those, again, you can kind of see all those in the reports that are published. And I'm going to pass it to you, Dr. Hickman, to talk about the prioritized plan.
Thank you, and thanks for making that connection in terms of the Tier 1. One thing we definitely want to make sure before we go forward with the prioritized plan is just describing that as part of our imperatives for DEI. One of them is early childhood. It's definitely a focus from our department, and we had to work closely with the early childhood division. You know, our students across the state, birth through 21, represent about 13% of the population, which is a smaller percentage for our early childhood group. But in the decisions that we make, really based on the research, we sometimes forget, even as professionals and educators, that the research clearly says that the earlier you intervene, the clearer and the better the outcomes are for our students with disabilities, for all of our students. We have data that supports that here in Maryland, the earlier that we've started to intervene, it's been about 50 or 60% of the children who have gone through early intervention have not needed it have not needed special education intervention after the 3rd grade. And so that is incredible. It is data, it is, and that we need to utilize to say, in terms of these recommendations and seeking additional funding for our early population, that is credible data that we need to utilize. Now go to the next slide. The next slide, so Ms. Zogby has shared with you we currently have like about 19, no, not about, we have 19 recommendations that we're working on. This Thursday, right? Was it Wednesday? This Thursday. This Thursday is our next special education work group meeting, in which we have a few recommendations that'll be going forward as well. And as she shared, we'll have December and January, and we expect more recommendations to come from that. And we are really okay with that, knowing that we are trying to touch on topics that are impacting our kids. But one thing that we know is that with 20 recommendations, it's going to be hard to resolve all of them immediately. And we saw that earlier in the process. And so what we decided to do collectively is to develop some priorities. So we're calling some things some foundational priorities that we have to work on right now. Some are others, and then there are some others that are focused, but they are off. They'll need to be addressed. Well, in front of you now, we knew that definitely looking at our grade level achievement expectations, our standards, and our related monitoring is pretty much the foundation for moving forward. We wanted to combine some of the recommendations that were made, and you'll see some overlap, and we also already see overlap for the remaining ones. But so the foundational priorities for number one was ensure grade level expectations, standards, related monitoring. Then we wanted to go and look at expanding the use of evidence-based practices to look at our students that are significantly disproportionate, our students in regular ed, and that over-reliance on segregated placements, as was shared, in terms of our least restrictive environment. Something that we want to do immediately, but we know is still going to take a little while, is looking at our supply and retention of teachers and to develop their teaching capacity. The supply and retention may take a little bit longer, but developing that teacher capacity by providing professional learning, PD, opportunities, funding for them to come into the field, opportunities for them to receive training, services, and just the knowledge and skills to work with our students with disabilities. I can share some of the things that we're doing already or have done in terms of developing one thing that I think helps is our inclusion guide that was developed. It was developed, Dr. Wright charged us with making sure that we put together something for our general educators in terms of helping them to understand how to work more closely with our students with disabilities. Now, it's not going to solve, fix, resolve all of our issues, but it is a resource that helps with those strategies for our teachers. We have been challenged with looking at our workload, our teachers' workload and caseloads in terms of, making the job more attractive or as attractive as possible. That's something that we're also looking at. Addressing disproportionality. You see disproportionality showing up in number 2 and number 4, and it's going to show up in funding, and it'll show up throughout LRE and all those things. 18 out of our 24 districts have been identified as being significantly disproportionate, as Ms. Zogby said, in the areas of placement, evaluation, and discipline. And most of those instances are students of color having a highly overrepresentation in special education in those areas. We've identified a outside third-party consultant to work with each one of our districts directly with us, with them, not directed by us. We identified an expert in the field who's seen progress to work with each one of our districts on developing their root cause analysis, therefore also helping them to develop their plans. But it's going to take some work. They'll be able to get that resolved and have the plans developed by the start of the school year, but then the work will begin there too. There's been a focus on conducting an adequacy study of special education funding. That's the recommendation. We're seeing some hiccups in that, but we have presented that on several instances to upper leadership. It's going to take all of us involved. It's going to take some involvement from the advocacy community as well, because the funding right now is just not there. But there is a interest. It's a recommendation from the work group, but it will help also to frame some of the other things that we do. Next slide, and I'm in control of it. I'm talking to myself. Prioritize plan. So in terms of our other near-term priorities, excuse me, we wanted to make sure that as a recommendation, ensure that our LEAs are in compliance with the least restrictive environment, reducing the overuse of LREC and separate school placements. And there's some things that have been ongoing for years. And I think the benefit of the work group is, yep, they've been in plans before, it's been identified, it's been recognized. I'll use the word sanctions, but there's definitely been some funds that have been moved around to address the need, but it hasn't been resolved yet. And we have some work to do in that area. That's why it's another near-term priority. It's something that's ongoing that we can't overlook. That there's like when I first got here last year, not that I fixed it, I wish I could say that I fixed this, but when I got here, it was 3,000 students, approximately 3,000 students waiting to get into our separate or our separate school, our non-pubs or additional placement. Now, why are they waiting? Some of that may be where our teachers, our staff, our schools need to look at focusing on how to create or develop programs more internally to address our students' needs. But now some of the other reasons are there's a teacher shortage, there's a special education teacher shortage, there's a shortage of resources and fundings, and it is causing some difficulty in placing our students with disabilities. So for more restrictive environments when they're needed. The next one was reviewing, refining, or replacing the Maryland online IEP. In terms of the online IEP, we recognize that the Maryland online IEP has been the system that has been in place for managing our students' IEPs for approximately 20 years. And it has been updated, it's been refined, it's been reviewed, but it has some things that it hasn't kept up with some of the other technology. And we have 4 districts that have stepped out and they're not using the Maryland online IEP. And we have another district that's currently looking at another program as well. And we are seeing that some of the reasons are for the online IEP is not talking to some of their other systems. So in order to address that, I'm going to hire a third-party review of our online IEP system. We currently have a survey out. We've met with some of the LEAs. We've met with the LEAs who aren't currently using it. We talked to some parents, but we have we're surveying our folks, and we're going to even see if we can move to the next level and get a third party to look at how we can make improvements to either review, to refine it, or replace it. Now, please know that over the 20 years with a program in place such as that, there's been an extensive amount of money that was spent on that, and is going to require the same to replace it across the state. So that'll be a hurdle that we have to come. And so that's that. I mean, the areas of focus to be added, again, early childhood, secondary, authentic family partnerships, students with most significant disabilities, and behavior and discipline. Why'd I fly through that? Because I'll show you that we have a report that's due. I can't see that one. I'm not sure why I have that in there. We have a report that's due December 1 to the AIB. So the final report will be submitted. While we recognize and you know that we had to extend, we have to extend our meeting to January. But in order to get the report due by December 1, it's like a 3-month process. So You will not have all of the meeting updates in that, but we'll meet December 1. You have the final report. We have a meeting December 18th, and then we have a final meeting January 29th. From January 29th, we will meet with our work group. We'll work with the work group to develop it's like 5 or however to determine how we're going to prioritize and develop a report to share with AIB by May 30th. And that's our update speed. That was on speed too. That was 40 minutes. I thought it was going to take a lot longer.
Thank you. So I'm going to open the floor up for our committee members for any questions that you might have for our guests. I was a 4th and 5th grade teacher, so I do wait time before I ask my questions.
First of all, thank you for this presentation. It's very detailed, and I like the arc. I wrote down notes, sorry. The arc of topics that you all are covering. I think those are highlighting some of the pivotal areas that we see, especially in special education. I'm just going to speak from a standpoint of a school-based speech language pathologist and kind of ask the question about like the collaboration piece of related service providers. I know that very far in between, we see that collaboration with or that inclusiveness of related service providers. So I was just wondering if when you come to, I mean, in your arc of topics, has collaboration with other service providers, including, you know, social workers, OTs, PTs, SLPs, is that being talked about as well?
I'll go first if you don't mind, Liz.
Please.
I'm glad, you know, when you started talking, I know that when we have our conversations and provide updates, whenever a related service provider goes first and speaks, it means that we did not articulate during the presentation or the conversation that when we say, I'm going to use the staffing and service delivery, or the arc of topics was teacher qualifications, recruitment, and retention. It's not just teachers, it's really special educators, those involved, related service providers. We talked about nurses, we talked about OT, PT, speech, and that intersection and how we're the entire child in the services. When we look at an IEP, we're starting from the present level of performance or present level of academic achievement and functional performance all the way through to transition. And so that's the group that we're talking about that provide the service. So when you say the collaboration, I'm not sure the collaboration, but I want to say the focus and the intentionality of looking at each group is what we are referring to. And those recommendations that are made, they are inclusive of that population.
Yeah, thank you for that. Because I'm also, while you were talking, I was also thinking about when you talked about the design instruction, and especially when you talk about like pre-K, just having that, you know, when you talk about co-teachers doesn't necessarily mean just a teacher certification, but it can be a speech language pathologist that is co-teaching with the classroom that could help support the teacher and show them different theories, excuse me, or different strategies that could especially work with the younger population. Because I love the fact that you brought up that the first, 3 years and the first early intervention is very pivotal of how we our trajectory, right? It sets the tone when it comes to pre-K and that early intervention. So it was excellent that you brought that up, and just thinking about different ways that we as related service providers can also support the special education teacher, and what type of policies also can be developed so that we have that. So we have that collaboration, so we have that co-teaching model, and so that we can support the whole student, as you were saying, like supporting the whole student, not just the academic part, but also that functional part as well. And I'm really big on like, that's just me personally, like, how are we supporting the students when they leave our school, right? So when they graduate, what foundational knowledge, what foundational skills do we have we provided them in order to be successful out in the world? So yeah, that was pretty much all my questions.
I have one more thing to add, but I think Ms. Aubrey, you look like you want to say something?
I do.
Okay, go.
Usually I do.
All right.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, definitely thinking about related service providers. We've got a couple of related service providers on the work group who are, bringing those issues up. And as Dr. Hickman pointed out, in specially designed instruction, when we talked about teacher qualifications, we talked about particularly during staffing and service delivery. And I mentioned there, IEP chairs and paraprofessionals, but also really thinking about things like should there be standards or models that are presented, guidance around caseloads or transitioning to a workload model. We talked a lot about that in the meeting. And, a lot of the recommendations are structured in a way where the feedback from the work group was documented. And then what we've asked is that MSDE take that feedback and develop a concrete plan around, based on that feedback. So a lot of the recommendations don't dictate what MSDE should do, but say, MSDE, we'd like you to develop a plan, and this is the feedback upon which we want you to base it. So there's things like workload that are in there. And just anecdotally, I was in a really great conference this weekend and was chatting with an OT who, just really tore my heart out. She was so overwhelmed by the 79 students on her caseload. No one can, that's not a job that's sustainable for anyone, and it's not providing the best service that we can provide for kids. So that is, yes, absolutely thinking about collaboration and making sure that we are always including all of those folks who can provide specially designed instruction and who contribute to the educational experiences and outcomes of students with disabilities.
I agree with you on that. And also just talking about the disproportionate rate of students with color also, what I'm asking the work group is, have you thought about different standards in which professionals, related services, and also teachers, because it's a standard that they're looking at in order to qualify the students for special education. And so it taps into a lot of the areas, the arc of topics that you all talk about. My question is, when you think about the disproportionate rate of students with disabilities, it is something that is not only prevalent in Maryland, but it's prevalent around the state. Around the country as well. So we're seeing that a lot. My question is what standards are you looking at different standards in order for people to use in order to qualify? I know that, we have the option to use informal measures, but at the same time, do we know what is the norm based on the culture group in that community, right? So it may be a different culture group in Baltimore as opposed to PG County. And there's certain culture norms that may be okay. But I just wonder, as a state as a whole, we're trying to look at everybody and how to be inclusive to everybody. So I just wonder, is there any guidelines when it comes to how we qualify, or has there been any talk about, those type of areas?
Before I pass it to Ms. Connor, I'm going to share with you that you are definitely correct. As someone who's been in three different states, and my focus has definitely been on students with disabilities, we see but sometimes problems being, we call them cyclical. They maybe get better in one area when you put a focus on, if you've been around long enough to know when EBD and ED and ID, and then we saw a high rate of those, and now we have a high number of students who are identified as other health impaired. We saw students that had identified with autism or Asperger's, just using some of those things, and we jump in and go one location and fix it, and then it's unintended consequences that it causes another effect. In terms of evaluation, yes, we have to look at in terms of how students are determined eligible. There's 14 categories under IDA, first of all. And so when we say special education, we're not just talking about one group. It's individualized. We have to look at students' unique needs. We have to make sure that we're matching those, and we can't identify all students. You know, there's a measure for identifying a student as learning disabled. There's one for identifying students as intellectually disabled, speech eligible for speech services. You know, the whole thing in the screening processes. But you have to consider culture. You have to consider background. You have to continue socioeconomic status, and access is what is hard. You know, the children have access. Now that's my high level. Now, Ms. Conlon's going to take you through all 14 disability categories. No, I'm sorry, and the evaluation process for each. But can you speak to just a few of the things that we've done in terms of evaluation?
Yes, I would be happy to do that. Although I do want to name one of the recommendations longer term of the work group is to develop, and now I know I'm quoting it wrong. So Dr. Hickman, Liz, please let me know if I got it wrong, but is to develop sort of eligibility checklists for initial evaluations that will help us combat some of this bias. Because as Dr. Hickman has stated, if you get things under control in one category, we often see it popping elsewhere. Where we've had some early gains with this has been in our eligibility process for determining students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. There are questions on that form that specifically reference bias, reference, excuse me. Of course, I'm getting the hiccups right as I start talking, that reference presuming communicative competence and establishing certain things like making sure that this is a student who has a reliable means of communication. One thing we've also done on the CCEIS side, is we are specifically looking at root cause analysis, and we are partnering with an organization who is going to work with our LEAs who are in DISPRO, because the reason, while bias is a nationwide problem and a statewide problem, it's going to look different county to county. And the bias that special educators in Baltimore City are encountering is very different than the bias that special educators in Wicomico are encountering. So it's really important that we give our LEAs the tools to look at things from a systems level, and that is tied to their CCEIS process and ultimately their CCEIS funding. So I am, from a programmatic standpoint, very excited about some of the opportunities that are being presented through the work group suggestions.
And if we can just stay there, because I will somewhat personalize this. I have young adults now, but when the youngest one was 3, I remember him starting speech. But when he finally got to elementary school, it was the thought of it's not speech, it's a behavior. Not understanding that for a Black boy, communication comes in frustration when you don't give me chances to actually get what I'm trying to say out. And you're constantly trying to fill in my words for me. And so I just remember as a mom advocating for some of that. So I appreciate looking at the biases and also wanting us to definitely, when I saw the part about preschool and pre-K and making sure that we focus there, because I think that's where it starts. As a former teacher, I used to be the one who invited anyone who was self-contained. And at that time, where the state I was in, it was emotionally disabled or behavioral disabled students, usually was Black boys. And when I looked through their IEPs to find out that you had normal reactions as a child and someone said that you were a threat, and that's why you ended up in that class, it took everything in me to make sure we exited you off of your IEP. And so that was my goal as a 4th and 5th grade teacher, that we're not sending you to middle school with this IEP because you never needed it really in the first place. And so one of the things I think the work group, and I heard a little bit of this about the co-teaching, but the biggest piece of that is even before the teaching is the co-planning. And so finding ways that when we're looking at the retention piece, a big piece of that is how are we actually supporting schools with developing schedules based off of student enrollment, and sometimes they just need that support. Everybody doesn't need to try to be so much where they don't have some kind of exemplar to look at. And I've been in other states as well where co-planning and co-teaching was a requirement, and it was built into the schedule for those staff members to truly plan together so it could be a seamless teaching and not look like one was a support to the head teacher or whoever in the classroom, and even including paraeducators in the related services. So my question to you is, when we're looking at some of those recommendations, have we started thinking of, even in our educational programs that come through the University of Maryland system, of them understanding that we should be training also not as separate special education, general ed content, but as co-planning, co-teaching units, so they're already aware of what it would take when you get into a LEA?
You brought up about 12 things I want to respond to.
Okay.
But
I'm passionate about this one too, as Shalita and I know.
absolutely. So last point first. Yes, in the meeting on teacher qualifications, recruitment and retention, one of the things we developed as a group was a list of what do you think the most important knowledge, skills, expertise is specifically for that overlaps between general and special educators, and then are there special domains of expertise that you would expect of general educators and of special educators? And really what we came up with was a very robust list of where that overlap is. And then asking MSDE to work with institutions of higher education to think about how can we make sure that all of our educators are coming out ready to teach all the kids that are in front of them. Yes, there's going to be some differences, and that's important. There's some specialization that we need to have, but to being prepared to teach the diversity, the expected diversity of every classroom is really critical. So that's definitely on our minds. You brought up schedules, and I just wanted to sort of say, Dr. Wright, one of the first special education work group meetings that Dr. Wright came to, she raised schedules as such a critical piece. And I'm glad that, it's come up again in the work around literacy and the literacy policy work. And also I think it dovetails with the blueprint in terms of the career ladder and thinking about that 40% of time that teachers are having non-instructional time, to make sure that some of that time ends up being collaboration, and that some of it is explicitly around supporting students with disabilities and thinking about how do we co-plan. I think there's a lot of power in all of that. And the last thing I wanted to say was around the behavior piece, which is, what you said about your son is something, we've talked a lot about in planning for the work group, and our meeting in January will be around behavior, and it's tied to discipline, but also it will be about kind of a bigger framing of thinking about understanding behavior, because I think what you describe happens to a lot of kids. They are frustrated about something, either a lagging skill that they have, or around not being planned for, or instruction that isn't suiting their needs for whatever reason. And yeah, there's a behavior that emerges from that, but it is not because they want to do something wrong. It is because their needs and support that they need is not being met. And when that ends up translating into getting a kid an IEP, and now we're tracking their data and we're, around their behavior, and we're still not piling in the right kind of support to meet that kid's needs, it becomes a snowball that doesn't redound to that kid's benefit. So I think, a lot of thinking about mindset shifting to understanding behavior being about communicating where a child has unmet needs for support, and being very cautious about understanding true eligibility and true disability, and making sure that we're identifying kids that really need special education services.
Nice. Joseph, I'll let you go, and then I'll go back.
Yeah. First off, I wanted to just give a big thank you to all of you for all your work and your time, and a lot of this. I mean, it's so clear how deliberate and strategic thinking that went behind all of the topics, and how they were lined up, and how they built on one another, and really elevating such important conversations and such a critical body of work. I think my big question is around next steps, and if that was, if this has been also part of the conversations around, of the many recommendations that you have, which of those recommendations are things that can be instituted directly by MSDE, if there are certain things that, maybe there is enough, there's enough interest in moving on that direction by particular LEAs, that just, going through and identifying best practices and highlighting good work and providing technical assistance, maybe that's the path forward for bringing some of these things forward. And then clearly there are probably some big boulders that can only be moved with the help of the legislature. So, I guess, of those, if there's been conversations internally about what the map is forward, and which things you feel like you can elevate, which things need to go to MSDE, which need to, potentially go to the AIB, in hopes that there will be recommendations made for changes made by the legislature. What's the game planning around this for trying to bring, some of these important recommendations to fruition?
So there's a few things. One, I've been a part of, and I think you all may have all been a part of, task groups, task forces, work groups. And this one is operating a little bit differently. In many instances, the final report is a report that has the recommendations, and then recommendations or commendations, and a plan of action. We've begun in January or February with developing recommendations, and then a call for a plan. We call it a plan for a plan, and not actually the plan. And they've turned into being the actual plan. So we see your concern. So let's try this. MSDE, a number of the recommendations are for MSDE to do certain things to help the school districts. So as an outsider coming in, this turned into the MSDE work group is what and we have tasks and we have responsibilities. But once we step back to see, we are coordinating some things. We don't own in special education, DEI, SES, all of MSDE. It is a work that we coordinate. We have to work with teacher recruitment. We have to work with assessment. We have to work with student services, student support. And we also have to work with the LEAs, because the LEAs have a lot of control, right? They have the control. We have influence, authority, and we can control where some of the funds go, right? We just need to use that a little bit more. right, Ms. Zogby? We need to use that and hold people accountable a little bit more. But in terms of there's MSDE things that need to be done, there are legislative things. We mentioned the early childhood piece.
Mhm.
We need to talk about the adequacy, the funding. There's a request for adequacy study. It was done before 2017 or so. And the legislature is the ones who put the money to the side so that that could happen. We need it to happen again, but someone needs to take it there. It needs to be prioritized above us, but we need to share it with you and the AIB and put it in a report. And you see the report and you see the priorities and help move that and advocate for that work to go forward. There are a few things with that are regulations that need to be changed. Um, we can look at non-pubs, we look at the funding, LRE, we look at staffing. You know, we look at the staffing and the workloads and putting some things in place. So now the plan going forward is that we can get to the last meeting, the January 29th meeting. If we can collectively come to an agreement on what those priorities are going to be immediately, midterm and long term, then we can get some things accomplished because some things are so huge. It's not the first time that kids have been significantly identified. That's my one. I'll go to another one. But it's not the first time the kids been significantly identified and disproportionately represented in special education kids of color. It's data shows it. Let's go back to coming away from that issue. It's not the first time that there's been a high representation of students that are out of in more restrictive environments, segregated settings. You know, those things have been around for a while. We can show some improvement, but we need to focus on it. So with that, I'll pause. I'll back off. I think I've answered. There are some MSDE things. There are some legislative things. There's some LEA things, and most of them are all. Everybody would want them to be a priority based on what it is you're dealing with. Right, Ms. Jones? You want it to be speech, language.
I want to just add one quick thing, which is that in terms of the work that's being done internally at MSDE, one of the things that we really tried to do in the prioritized plan, and I think we'll do this more when we finish up with the recommendations and kind of come up with a final prioritized plan, is many of the recommendations have a lot of overlap of task. So it actually, part of the work is trying to identify the pieces of the recommendations that merge with the existing work that's already underway. And some of it is about, a little bit of a shift in, well, they're always updating the guidance. How can we update the guidance to reflect this new set of understandings? Or how can we, there's monitoring that goes on annually. It's a regular process. That monitoring can shift when we can look at new things. We can put new things into guidance, and then we can decide that we're gonna have that be part of the monitoring protocols. So there's ways that it's not all new work, I guess is my point. Much of it will be integrated into the existing workflow.
Dr. Grant?
Great evening. So I was over here just jotting down many, many notes. I think what you all presented was just great information. I found some ways to connect what you all were saying that's happening in a work group around Pillar 1 to our Pillar 4 work. Just hearing the recommendations around SPED and ELL. So I think that was awesome to hear. It makes me very reflective as a current principal as to things that we're doing at the school level to make sure we're meeting the needs of those students. And the first thing that popped in my head was my thought and then question was, is there a MTSS, multi-tiered system and support plan that is universal from LEA to LEA? We do this first, then we do this, then we do this. And then if the student doesn't grow, then we have this done. So that way we're implementing that multi-tier support, and we're implementing response to intervention for a number of 8 to 9 weeks to gather data. And if we can implement this plan across LEAs, systemically, and everybody got to follow this process, because when too much is in your hand, we tend to have a lot of autonomy and things get a little swayed, and we're not giving the opportunity to see growth as we should if we implemented a good plan for student success. So I had a question around that. I'm gonna save my question until the end. My thought also, because all of these things that we implement at the LEA level, it comes down to the schoolhouse. And then, of course, it goes to our teachers. And the one thing I wanted to share is that many of our teachers are career changers, and they themselves need professional learning around these things. They don't understand multi-tier support. And so we at the school level have to make sure we're implementing learning for the teachers at the school level that's implementing support for students. Many of them don't know this thing. So you have to have instructional leaders in a class, in a building, in classrooms who understand these supports and are implementing professional learning to build teachers' capacity around this, because they're not coming out of college with a degree in special ed today. I can't find a special ed teacher to hire, and I've been looking. So we got to know who we have, who we're recruiting, and then making sure that we're giving them what we need intentionally. Too much at one time is going to make these individuals burn out and run another direction. So we got to be intentional about our next steps. And so just the emphasis on the personal development and not allowing teachers to feel overwhelmed is so important. And just let's grow one level at a time. But my question about response to intervention, because I think this is a biggie. At my school, we have a process. And so we have to do 8 to 9 weeks of RTI before any student is referred for special education. We have to have data. We look for growth, unless a parent requests to have their child tested. But most parents, when they know that they're getting some sort of small group learning with their child, that they're being pulled 2 to 3 times a week by someone, they're willing to go through that process. And so my question is, how can the implementation of a response to intervention program or a multi-tier support program or framework be adapted across all LEAs to better meet the needs of our special education students, or before they even become special education students, to meet the needs of our struggling students?
I'm going to go, Ms. Connor, that's some of the work you've been doing with the literacy program, with the literacy team. I'm going to say that there's some part of the conversation is in the inclusion guide, but before you do, I want to touch to the professional learning piece, if you don't mind, before you do the MTSS, because I have a vision that I know and what I've seen that's quite important, but we can't resolve it all at one time. So I'm starting with the leaders. I'm starting with the special education leaders. And I created a leadership academy. I took them to like a 2-day leadership academy. And then I have a monthly set up with them, 90 minutes monthly focused on either leadership in terms of collaboration and leadership, but also communication and things that impacted our students with disabilities, and LRE, special design instruction, topics that are specific to special education. That's the special education leadership across the state. And if I could do an academy for them and teachers and general ed and special education, I would. On our list of things to do in terms of bringing folks together, there's what's called our CSI schools. There's about 180 schools identified. I think it's 180, but it's 100. Let me use 100, but I think it's 180 schools in Maryland who are identified as CSI needing more comprehensive services, right? Not the CEIS, but the CSI. But they've been identified under that because of students with disabilities, right? So leadership training needs to be focused there, and that would be a step for that. But that's huge. So I'll pause. Can you speak to the MTSS piece, RTI?
I sure can. So Dr. Grant, to your point about, well, what does it look like to mandate, because in previously MSD has in partnership with a number of organizations, including AIR, including MCIE, issued MTSS guidance. But guidance and you must do this are two separate things, right? Well, the literacy policy mandates response to intervention, especially for those early grade learners who are showing difficulties with reading. We're about to see what that looks like when all of our LEAs have to have this shared practice. That is part of the work of our literacy group, but it's also part of our work statewide to make sure that we are setting up our educators with resources so they're not, falling flat on their faces when we roll this out. Part of our work with the literacy department in MSDE, we have specific work group recommendations around literacy that are included in our plan for a plan. And my role in that is I coordinate with that team to make sure that everything we're including is updated. So you guys actually will see their updates, because I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe literacy was early enough that it will be included in this final report.
Thank you. I know for Montgomery County Public Schools, we already do have an MTSS platform. So we have started that. We have student well-being teams that are in schools that are not just about social emotional, but now have also gone into some of those academic pieces and what is happening there. I would say it goes back to what Dr. Hickman said. Really, it's two things can be true at the same time. There's a lot of multi-layers of the work. And for me, as someone, as a mom of three, and then also as a former teacher, we got to also go back to what is effective first instruction. And what does that look like for all students? Like, what is effective first instruction before we even think about, oh yeah, these kids are not getting it. But if majority of the students in your school are not getting it, then we got to have a conversation about effective first instruction. It shouldn't be that majority of your students are not able to meet the standard. And sometimes that is not a knock on any teachers. It is who we are teaching. How I was as a student is different than how I was when I was a teacher of new sets of students. Then I had 3 young adults and they were different students. Now this is a different group of students. And so we have to truly be understanding of that. So if Dr. Grant, if you ever want, I can connect you with someone. But my last question was, as someone who works with community schools, you guys highlighted a lot of work around the family engagement and understanding of special education services, period. And so I know in concentrations of poverty, trust and relationships are big. So in the conversations, how has that been uplifted for those who, for many reasons, whether it be their own experience as a student when they were in school, how they've been engaged with through the process, or even how they've been disengaged with through the process because they might not have the funding to advocate for themselves the way that they should. How are you guys tying that in, or would that be a part of that final report? Because that's a different layer of biases. One is around instruction and another is around how we engage those that are in concentration of poverty, where we make a lot of assumptions about why they're not engaged.
I'm so glad you brought this up. So actually our meeting on Thursday will be bringing back the recommendation from our meeting on authentic family school partnership. And that meeting really had kind of 2 components. The first one was really about how authentic family school partnership doesn't start with special ed, right? It starts way before that. So families have to build relationship and trust, and there's a whole level of cultural competency, and some of that is around families whose first language may not be English, but there's all kinds of diversity in our schools and differences, cultural differences between teachers and the communities that they serve, and building those, figuring out the strategies for building trustful relationships is such an important foundation. So and one reason for that, and then our sort of second piece was because when you then have a child who gets identified as a student with a disability, and all of a sudden you're in this totally new world of acronyms and IEP meetings, and it's very stressful for families. If you're already built on a foundation of trust, you're halfway there, right? And if folks in schools really believe that families are the experts on their children, even if those people don't speak the same language as you, even if they don't have a college degree and you're a teacher with a master's degree, right? If you really believe that parents are the experts on their kids, then you are figuring out a way to build a relationship to elicit that expertise from parents to the benefit of kids. And so the recommendations will kind of speak to that, how we can do that, because this is not unknown work, right? There's actually lots of evidence and research around how can schools go about building those kinds of authentic relationships. So we'll have some direction. We think that the MSDE and our LEAs can go through to build on what is already happening, but to make it stronger and also speak to some of the specifics, whether it's around cultural competency, around how can we bridge divides like language barriers and things like that. So.
Thank you. And if y'all ever need help with that, if you want to talk to Derek Anderson, the Executive Director for Community Schools with MSDE, just tell him to send the all call out to community schools. Our community school coordinators will always love to advocate and show you ways to communicate and support those services. Dr. Grant, you have the last question before we close out.
So thank you. What I've also noticed, and we talked about pre-K, is there is a huge gap in the transition from pre-K to kindergarten. And data within my LEA, and I don't know about others, students that come from pre-K programs, they are lower than students who are not in pre-K programs. And that is slightly concerning, highly concerning. So the question that I had is, because of this huge transition from a pre-K to kindergarten, and data is showing that, and I know we no longer have KRA assessments, will there be a replacement readiness assessment for kindergarten? And then also, will there be any changes to how the pre-K standards are so they can come to K slightly more prepared than when they are leaving pre-K? Because they enter K in most cases not meeting what these K standards are, what the kindergarten standards are.
I'm happy to speak to the assessment. Yes, so starting so not the 24-25 school year, we have a hiatus here, but starting in school year 25-26, there will be a new KRA assessment. The reason the assessment was pulled was because there was significant evidence to show that bias was coming in. And when Dr. Wright had that information, she did not feel it was ethical to issue a test that we know to be problematic. But yes, a new test is coming. In terms of, I know that the early learning standards were just revised, so I don't think there are plans at this moment to revise the Common Core standards starting in kindergarten. But what I would be happy to do is connect you to Dr. Cook for any follow-up questions. If you can just drop your email in the chat, I'd be happy to make that connection.
Thank you so much. It kind of threw us, I know for community schools, it threw some people for a shock when the KRA was not there, because they had used that as their baseline data from when they became a community school. So now they're trying to figure out how to actually show improvement and growth, because they finished this year with their implementation plan. So it threw some schools across the state for a loop, but totally understand if you're addressing bias. First of all, I just want to say thank you all tremendously for the presentation. it is exactly what we were looking for and needing, and understanding the intersectionality of all our pillars and just how they are literally kind of like a tapestry. They are woven together very tightly with the blueprint. And so we wanted to make sure to highlight that in Pillar 4, because there are things that we will then be trying to make sure from our pillar is highlighted and brought up across LEAs when they're doing their revisions to their plans, or even for those in the general public who are watching, so that they know exactly how interwoven this is. So when things come up at legislation, they understand how to advocate with their representatives on behalf of all students in the state of Maryland. So we thank you for your time. So we have 3 minutes left. And so our next thing and only really thing was for our, bye, thank you. For our next meeting in December, we were looking at, I think, bringing in someone from either the EML work group if they were available, and then also any LEAs that could speak to how they are supporting the implementation of Pillar 4 when it comes to English language learners. Was it anything else that came up? I know we talked about related service providers and doing that after we got back from winter break. So I'm definitely already looking at some people for that and other LEAs, not just my own, but if you know of anyone who could be a good person to reach out to, please just email me and let me know, and I'll work with Lisa to engage them to see who can be a part of our agenda. Are there any questions or anything else someone wants us to focus in on? No, we're good. All right, so I thank you guys for a wonderful meeting and the engagement. I definitely have a lot that I'm getting ready to read, as they were providing links and updates to us that now have my head spinning, even just for community schools in my regular job, of how to kind of share some of this out to my colleagues around how we can support that work as well.
This was a great meeting, a lot of wonderful information presented.
Yeah.
And you know how I do. I start processing, like, what am I doing at my school? What do I need to implement? So great. Thank you.
Thank you. So at this time, we will say it is 5:30 on the dot, so we can say we have ended this meeting for November. And everyone be safe, stay hydrated during the break next week.
Happy holidays.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Great meeting.
Nice. Are we still live stream, or do you stop everything?
Hold on.
Nice job, Hope.
Thank you. They had a lot of great stuff.